Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on technology adoption and AI, where we'll be talking about transforming transactional practices. I'm Caroline Hill, I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Legal IT Insider. I've got a great panel with me today to discuss some topics around looking at technology. We're not just going to be talking about Gen AI, we're going to be talking about technology in the round, looking at how technology is transforming transactional practice, which practices are ahead of the curve, and we will be talking about the explosion of interest in Gen AI, what it teaches us about the possibilities for adoption, and also looking at some of the early use cases for generative AI itself. To introduce my panel, it's great to see so many of you joining already. So first up, we have Latera's manager for practice advisors, Josephine Good. Josie was previously a practice consultant at Kira, and before that she was an associate in the M&A team at Sherman and Sterling. Hi, Josie.
Hi, thanks, Caroline, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Very much looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, likewise. We've got Shoesmith's commercial partner, Simon McArdle, who specialises in commercial contracts, and he heads up the firm's technology and innovation service line, including its AI contract review service, so a review product, which I always want to call CIA, but it's actually SEER. Hi, Simon.
Hi there, Caroline. Lovely to be here.
Yes, thanks so much for joining. And last but not least, we've got Shoesmith's Senior Associate, Dan Greatorex, who's also in the commercial team and works with Simon on SEER. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Caroline. Hi, everyone. Great to be here.
Yeah, great. Nice to see you. So what's great is the panel are not only qualified solicitors, but have long been involved in delivering AI to transform transactional practices and procedures. And I'm really looking forward to chatting through some of the topics with you today. Just as a matter of housekeeping, if everybody could just enable your chat function. I know we've done this for years and years and everybody's quite familiar with it, but just it's great to see everyone's already saying hi. So good to see so many of you here. We are happy to take questions. It's going to be an interactive session. I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat with so many people listening. If the panel sees a question that you want to answer and I miss it, please jump in. Certainly my job is to facilitate, not control. So the idea is that we all have a really great chat today. If there's lots of what I suggest also perhaps is that and again, you don't need me to tell you this, but there's so much interest around this topic. If you want to initiate a conversation within the chat, that's absolutely fine. I may have to ask if there's a question, if you can perhaps put it in bold or something to help us differentiate it from the rest of the chat, which sometimes is helpful. And then so I think that's probably all there is to say. Thank you so much. We're going to talk about technology. As I said, we're not just jumping straight into Gen AI because there's so much. Some of the questions we had ahead of this session were also just around how technology is helping to transform transactional practices. We will be talking about AI, and then as I said, we'll be moving on to Gen AI. Just to sort of kick us off, though, do you think there are certain practices such as M&A that are visibly ahead of the curve when it comes to adoption of legal technology, and do you think that's changing? Let's start with Simon, perhaps.
So I think the likes of M&A teams probably have historically been a little bit ahead of the curve when it comes to tech, but it is, I think, a driver of certain aspects of M&A work, due diligence in particular, where you will have very high volumes of documents where the task required in relation to that document is relatively straightforward, should we say, or relatively limited. And as a result, the nature of that type of work, I think, has lent itself to even the early iterations of the types of technology that we're going to talk about on this call. So by virtue of the nature of their work, they were the low-hanging fruit for some of this technology. There's also an interesting idiosyncrasy with something like due diligence, in that due diligence classically has always been a risk-reward approach. On a large M&A deal, clients, law firms are very, very well used to limiting the scope of due diligence in order to deliver something to a timescale, to a budget, to whatever, to make it practical. Limiting of scope comes with a degree of risk. There is a risk, there is a commensurate reward with that. So they come to the technology party already with that mindset of acceptance of a degree of risk because of a limited scope in things. And I think that too has helped them be an early adopter of technology, where certain other parts of the market don't necessarily think in those terms or understand how that risk reward piece would work, and therefore would naturally be slower to adopt technology. Is the rest of the market catching up? Yes, I believe it is, and I think we'll touch on a number of those areas as we go through this session.
Yeah, I know we've had questions about real estate, haven't we? Because I guess the same, I know you can't necessarily speak for real estate, but that's certainly one of those areas where the same thing could apply, and where we've seen quite a lot of AI-based innovation, I suppose.
It's right. I'm not a real estate lawyer. I am married to a real estate lawyer, so I'm a real estate lawyer in law, and I know that certain practice areas within real estate are voluminous in terms of the documents that they've got to process. So large corporates with large lease portfolios that need to be constantly monitored, scrutinized, and have very challenging, demanding deal timescales, have had a dire need for this kind of technology that helps manage cost, it helps manage timescales, it helps accelerate the process of them operating their businesses and securing the properties and protecting the properties that they need. So that there too was not necessarily the same as DD in terms of it being a restricted scope, but there's been a high degree of demand and necessity for the technology that I think has catalyzed the adoption of it in that space.
Mm-hmm. And then, so perhaps Josie, where within across transactional departments, which obviously everyone listening in, I think we've got a particular, that's what they're interested in. So let's kind of stick with that. So where do you think you're seeing the biggest uptake of technology? And would you say that something like that drafting and due diligence tools, AI-based tools such as Kira, such as Sia, are becoming table stakes?
Yeah, I definitely think in some places they are. And I think Simon's right. There are inherent sort of characteristics of the work that the transactional teams are doing that lends itself perfectly to the use of technology. So I always say, without the pain points, there's no point in using technology for technology's sake. Unless that pain point exists, then there's no need to bring in the technology. So I think we've, when Kira came to market, over 10 years ago, there was a massive pain point there in diligence. And I think in many ways, sort of doing diligence in a very manual way is now no longer sort of the best practice. And we've seen sort of the adoption of Kira across sort of all our global firms to sort of try to bring those efficiencies and a little bit more collaboration the way people are doing diligence. And I think, it's easy to forget the things that have become table stakes. There was a time when people were doing diligence in rooms with big boxes, and it's easy to forget how far we've innovated when something sort of comes along like generative AI, and we all think that everything's brand new and this is the first innovation of its kind in legal. And I think it's definitely had an impact that's very notable compared to the last 10 years. But I think there's been sort of slow and steady innovations in lots of the processes, be that sort of drafting, transaction management, diligence, as well, that maybe haven't been as exciting, but definitely have transformed the way that people are doing their transactional work.
It wasn't all that long ago that I was writing about contract review and how people were doing, very nervous about it. They were doing side by side, human comparatives, probably some still are, but and then it was all kind of very cutting edge. It is interesting how recent changes have sort of, I don't know, yeah, it's funny, a transformation happens quickly but slowly, right? Dan, were you going to jump in at that point?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just things like just a red line, for example, when you receive a signed version of a document and making sure that it's the same as the one that you sent out, those kind of things, or even just OCR in documents. That's all tech that's now almost taken for granted, both within law firms and IHLs. The only other thing I was going to mention is in terms of uptake, there's the kind of diligence side of things. And then with things like SIA, it's almost, if you're working to a playbook, then that's quite an easy or obvious choice to then try to automate that playbook if it's relatively repetitive type work that you're doing, because that's where you can use things like rules-based AI to code it in. So then you're getting AI to do that work for you.
Can you tell us at this stage a bit more, just for people, I think a lot of people on this call will be familiar with Kira, but maybe not all of them will know about it. Just tell us briefly about it.
Yeah, sure. So SIA's AI-powered contract review solution. So it's powered by Thought River, one of our tech partners. And effectively, it's about automating playbooks. So we have an out-of-the-box solution that's based on our way of the world, if you like. So it produces red line markups on documents, or can create reports if, you know, a supplier or customers presented it as non-negotiable, effectively.
And I should mention at this point, so because I guess at the outset, it sounds like a competitor to Kira, but you're a sort of heavy user of Kira as well, right? And other solutions, but just
yeah, exactly. It's about different use cases. So to Josie's point, on the diligence side of things, we're massive users of Kira, particularly on the real estate side, but on the more commercial contract side of thing, outside of due diligence, the main part of our job really is negotiating and reviewing documents for our clients.
And I think Josie's made the point before about actually the focus for firms is about transforming the way that you do business, right? I don't know if you want to revisit. I thought that was a really interesting point that you made when we were discussing this, Josie.
Yeah, and I think the transformation is so different for every firm in terms of how they bring technology into the business. So a lot of what I do in my role now is really working with firms to understand what does sort of adoption of technology look like for them. And it can be so varied depending on what sort of their strategy is as a business. And I think what Shoesmiths have done in terms of sort of carving out a whole sort of service element is completely different to a firm that is just getting the technology to the lawyers at their desk and getting everyone to sort of use it in their own way. So I think there's a lot of different ways that people think about bringing technology in. And I think the best firms are the ones that really think strategically about sort of the structure of their business. And there's, you know, innovations in that, I think, and it's definitely an exciting time for law firms thinking about particular structures and particular opportunities to sort of serve their clients in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's interesting because I like the reference to Shoesmiths and, you know, the way that you've worked on things. And I think in terms of, let's talk a bit about the drivers of adoption, because I know, Simon, you talked about that, I think you said clients don't choose tech just because it's funky or something like that, you know, like why, what do you think is driving adoption?
So at a law firm level, client demand has to be at the forefront of adoption, but there has to be a return on investment. That ROI piece is always going to be a critical factor for any client, for any law firm for that matter, bringing in tech. And you're right, no self-respecting business would buy tech just because it's cool. It has to fulfill a function, a need. And from a law firm perspective, there must be a market for those services. We recognize that problems, issues, identifying problems within the marketplace, things that could be better, is the friction that creates the spark of innovation. So inventions come from problems. but adoption comes from client demand and a proven business model. So for us, it's always keeping at the absolute front of our minds what are our clients telling us, what is the market telling us about what they need in terms of the legal service, and where does technology make elements of that legal service better, quicker, cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps we should just touch on, I think, so the demand, but and once you get through, it's interesting, isn't it? You've got the before the clients sort of come in the door, but then afterwards, I think, Dan, you've made the point that it has to be usable, and otherwise, it, you know, in terms of when they're going to actually use it, it just becomes shelfware, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you can, there's an element of getting people through the door, but if you think about tech, and ChatGPT is a great example of it in the fact that it is really usable, and that's why there's been such a high uptake of it. The flip side to that, I guess, is reliability, because something has to be usable, but if it's not reliable, then it's more likely that the decision makers are going to put limitations on that usage. So already on the ChatGPT side of things, we're seeing businesses and law firms implement policies to control usage. That might be because of hallucinations, it might be just generally because of confidentiality concerns, etc. But it's striking that balance, I guess. What we've found is that at the moment, certainly, tech is almost an augmented solution in that it's still human-led. It's still often the individuals on the ground that are using it. A company might buy a piece of tech, but if it's, you know, it might be the junior lawyers using it. If the junior lawyers don't think it's very good, then you won't get that return on investment, because they might just continue to do things manually without the tech.
Yeah. We're going to come on to talk more about the Gen AI side shortly, but I do think it's fascinating. You know, the uptake of ChatGPT is just incredible, and it's such a battle, isn't it? It's unusual to have a battle to stop people using technology, in my experience.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of firms that I've spoken to who are trying to work out how to stop people from using it, and a lot of them have decided that it's just an uphill struggle, and that they're just going to have to create policies around it to try and stop them from putting client data in and the likes. But it is incredible in terms of what that tells us. Before we do come on to talk about Gen AI specifically, there's a few more things I would really like to touch on in terms of just pure tech. There's so much focus on Gen AI, but I do think that, as Josie's kind of touched on, you know, we need to revisit perhaps where we are. There's a lot of potential for Gen AI, but actually, you know, I think people have to have a very strategic approach to it rather than a bit of a sort of hysterical approach. But so, but do you think, I mean, what do you think? So with Gen AI, I suppose this is a different question, but generally, what do you think are the best strategies you've seen for adoption? Is there like an adoption 101 when it comes to tech that can potentially transform the practice?
I know we're thinking of it as this whole new thing, but as we think about sort of the technology that's come before and the lessons we've learned, I think what Simon said in terms of being driven by clients and being driven by the market is what's happened with ChatGPT. So, you know, just being you know, responsive to what clients are asking for, and really being guided by what they want in terms of client service and client delivery. So, you know, if you've got clients who are saying that they're going to start using this technology or want you to start doing it, then that's going to shape the way you approach it. And I think actually, you know, lawyers and law firms are very well placed in the way they think about these sorts of things, right? They're risk averse, which is a great place to start, definitely opportunistic and very responsive to what's happening in the market. And I think the reason we've seen so much excitement is because that excitement is not just existing for the law firms, it's existing for the market and all the corporates that the law firms are serving. So if everyone's that excited about it, you know, the law firms want to be part of that because they're the ones providing that client service. So they need to always just match what their clients are wanting to see from them. And I think, you know, we're already starting to get to the point, I think, where, you know, we see it because people tell us they're sort of putting Kira in a pitch, and it's now no longer that you can just say we're using technology. It's really about how you're using that technology. And so I think when you think about adopting sort of generative technologies, it's about still, not going away from the basics, which is it's all about client service and client delivery, and communicating with your clients on how you're perhaps delivering things and how you can be more efficient and how you can meet them in terms of what they're thinking about. So that should always be the driver, I think, in terms of adopting anything. And I think the lawyers are doing all this sort of risk assessment anyway, so that bit's fine. I think you've got good coverage on that part.
Dan, you're nodding.
Yeah, and I guess the other side of it is just setting expectations. Sometimes better is better, and searching for the perfect solution can hold you back. Particularly, if you're a lawyer trying to get stakeholder buy-in or buy-in from other teams or partners. If you are constantly searching for the perfect solution as part of a roadmap where everyone else is getting on with, their business as usual work, you might not get anywhere. It might be a case of setting those expectations early as what better looks like, starting with that and then bolting things on, improving as you go, not necessarily waiting all the way until you've got something that is exactly what you would want.
Yeah.
There's a really famous exchange involving Steve Jobs. I would encourage everyone to look this up if you haven't done so already. It's on YouTube. So it's Steve Jobs responding to an awkward question from an audience member, which is about 20 years old, but what he says is as pertinent now as it was then. And the gist of it was around, you must always start with the problem, start with the user experience and work backwards from that. How is tech going to facilitate the thing that you want to achieve, the user experience that you want to achieve, rather than starting with a cool piece of technology and trying to figure out where you are going to sell it. And the technologies invariably that are adopted and become a indelible part of everyone's practice are the ones that are principally focused on making a certain part of your day easier than it was before. So that I think, more than anything else, that ease of use, almost invisibility of the technology, would be the key thing for me in terms of that adoption 101.
And also retaining that, because we're a human business, we're people business, perhaps that's a better way to describe it. And at the end of the day, people like that. I don't think that anybody comes into law or wants to be serviced by a law firm, perhaps with some exceptions, certainly not at this level, purely by a computer. I don't think that's the objective. So I think it's about being very strategic, isn't it? About where the technology should take out the inefficiencies and automate routine, and then where you can free up people to actually focus on the things that they do best, which is the very strategic thinking and the EQ, which I think is going to become increasingly important in future years.
Yeah, I mean, so when we introduce Kira to people who haven't seen it before, we have some introductory slides. I can tell you they haven't changed for years and years and years, because the first slide in that says human plus machine is better than human or machine alone. And it hasn't changed because the principle hasn't changed. That is really sort of should be, and I think is for lots of sort of technologies, the guiding principle of their use. And I think sort of everything that's happened with ChatGPT has evidenced that even more so, but I think that principle really still reigns very true.
Yeah, I hosted a webinar just earlier this week where somebody said they're trying to build bionic lawyers, not robot lawyers, which I thought, right, I thought that was quite nice. So before we move on to the Gen AI topic in earnest, and we've got lots of questions from people already, which is someone's just asked me a question, but I'll come to that. It's actually directed at me. I saw my name, sorry. So the market is really volatile, right? So it's a very strange market for all of us, actually. And there's a lot of economic volatility. M&A deals are down. Does that mean that there's less of a focus on, should be less of a focus on technology or more? It's a bit of a slightly provocative question, but what do you think?
I think it goes to the complication between the relationship of, well, the relationship between technology and efficiency, which I think has always got people sort of very opinionated in terms of whether technology brings efficiency, and that can be beneficial or not to a law firm that is sort of structured around people, you know, billing their time. And so I think, at least in some of the conversations I've had, and the others will have a good sense of this as well from their conversations, that it is changing some of those characteristics we talked about. You know, only a year ago when I was talking to people, it was all about efficiency because they had so many deals that they really needed that technology assisted review to even get through the volume of diligence that they were dealing with. I think that's not the case now, but it doesn't mean that there's not other characteristics that are then driving the need for the use of technology. So, you know, it might be sort of really wanting to differentiate yourself because there is less work out there. And, you know, if another firm is using technology and you're not, is that going to be the differentiator? And then I think it's still raising questions sort of around cost and around efficiency, but I just think it's in sort of in a slightly different scenario than it was perhaps a year ago.
Yeah, the other thing to add is just, if there is a decrease, that almost gives you an opportunity to maybe try out new technologies. The classic catch-22 is that you need to devote time in order to save time. So that can often be a barrier to adoption in the first place. So if there is a slight slowdown, maybe now's the point to see what is out there if you've got some resource there, because once it starts up again, you're going to want the technology, and you might not have the time to devote to procurement then.
It's also probably true to say, because Josie highlights very well the good use for tech. I've got so much work, so much opportunity that I must have technology in order to exploit it all, which is absolutely the good version. The bad version, if you wanted to call it that, is generally speaking, a contracting market will result in price being more of a factor than it was in a very buoyant market. And where price becomes a factor, efficiency becomes more important. And where technology can deliver that efficiency, it perhaps heightens the requirement for businesses to augment their services to still deliver profitably at a more competitive price point if there's less work around.
Yeah, and there's so many examples of in previous bear markets of firms that did invest and who have reaped the benefit. I think that's where you need a management team that are open to these kind of conversations, and it's heartening to see more IT heads on the board. I think that's now, personally, I think that's now mandatory to have that woven into the strategy in order, particularly now with this sort of big sort of kind of turning point. We had a question which I'm going to address now, if that's okay, because I don't know whether it was a specific Gen AI one or but I think it could be applicable to everything. So I really like it. What should young lawyers be doing to prepare themselves for use of more technology in their future careers? And you can relate that to either AI or Gen AI. I think it's very relevant to both.
I think it's probably one of the things that we maybe neglected to mention in what is driving adoption, which I think in many ways is the next generation in a couple of places. So I've certainly had conversations with people who are sort of looking to partnership, looking as to sort of how they differentiate themselves against others and what is their strategy for the business going to be for the next sort of 10, 20 years. And we see what's happened in the last 6 months, making technology part of that discussion as they sort of talk with the partnership about the future of the firm, I think is definitely exciting. And then sort of right at the start, you know, those lawyers coming into firms, we see it with sort of sessions we do for summer associates. You know, firms are wanting to make it very clear to those summer associates coming in that this is sort of a tech forward firm that is investing in their lawyers and really thinking about how to sort of, you know, make sure that the firm sort of has that readiness for the future. So I think the sort of energy and enthusiasm that the sort of next gen have for the technology is great. And I think it has to come from bottom up and top down always. You know, it needs to be sort of encouraged by the partnership and of course by the clients, but there's definitely a lot that we're seeing in terms of the next generation driving adoption.
Have you seen what works in Shoesmiths?
Yeah, so I think with young lawyers, it's like Jason said, it's about the enthusiasm side of things. It's being willing to put yourself out there and familiarize yourself with different types of tech, both that are used internally and that are available on the market. Because, you know, we keep speaking about this human plus technology side of delivering legal services. That's not going to go away anytime soon. So, you know, even if it's learning how to use Word efficiently or PowerPoint efficiently, you know, that's a way of young lawyers differentiating themselves against peers. And, you know, gradually you'll then move to a place where, you know, everyone's familiar with using that tech, as well as actually identifying new opportunities, you know, new areas where there might be client demand, and then looking at different vendors to what technology is available to resolve it.
Yeah. So who do you think, who now definitely devoting to Gen AI, like where are you seeing, who's leading the adoption? It's you know, I'm really glad that we've kind of set the scene, and we're not approaching this in a hysterical fashion, but who is leading the adoption as far as you've seen within law firms? And let's talk about the ChatGPT. Like, how do you think firms should approach ChatGPT and or other LLM type technologies?
Strategically, cautiously, and recognizing that it is a tool, not the tool to end all other tools. The power of Gen AI is self-evident, and we are starting to see more products come onto the market that are taking the time to articulate very clearly to the market what the benefit would be. Microsoft Copilot recently announced their some would say rather high price for the use of it, have been quite careful in press releases and the way that they've gone about describing that tool, and demonstrating what the benefit will be to the user, insofar as you can take minutes from a meeting to create a proposal. There's an obvious time saving thing there. So that's great. Going back to the point on that sounds cool, we should get it, that's never going to be the correct approach. There needs to be an assessment of the likely ROI, and at the cost point of something like Copilot, you'd need to assess, does the efficiency saving within the business pay for itself? And we're going through that process at Shoesmiths already, and so we've got a sense as to the amount of time or user time that would need to be saved in order for it to essentially pay for itself or return that investment. So cost is a major part of it. The other area is reliability. We know that it can be an enormously powerful tool, but we also know that it can be it has limits in terms of its reliability. And as Dan alluded to, there are many firms already putting in place policies to prevent the overuse of technology by lawyers to that would lead to serious errors. And there are a number of well-publicized instances of tech being overused and therefore really rather serious errors occurring off the back of it. So it's about that strategy, it's about the ROI, but also about recognizing the tool for what it is. It's useful, but it's fallible.
Yeah, I've seen a mini demo of Copilot, and for transactional practices, in terms of the admin side of things, you know, in terms of it can, for example, there's me humanizing it, but it will summarize in a meeting in Teams and provide you with the key action points, for example. And there's so many admin sort of applications that it can speed up. I think that people are going to find it's a bit mind-blowing, but the price point, as you said, $30 per user per month is bit mind-blowing as well. There's quite a few questions coming in, and they're just to hosts and panelists. If you want everybody to see them, you need to change the settings to everyone. So I should have been scanning this as I thought. So I like this one. So I'm not going to read your name because it's just to hosts and panelists. I have a firm that has mostly older partners. What's the best way to get them educated on AI? It's a really good point. Anybody?
I think it's in some ways taking the AI out of it. I'm going to be intentionally repetitive here and repeating what Simon said, where he said, you know, it's something that is solving a problem, whether that's AI or something else. The emphasis should be on it is a solution to a problem. And so if that's the presentation to the partner who really is sort of overwhelmed by the concept that there is you know, a machine learning element or a generative AI element, and it's really presented as a solution to a problem, I think that's something that anyone can really understand.
Yeah, I don't know if you had anything. Guys, I don't know if you had anything to add.
It's working backwards. It's presenting the positive side of things, and as we've touched on a few times, just making it as easy as possible. The best technology you don't even realize you are using per se. So
true. When we become, I was at an online sort of helped to host an online conference this week, and we were saying that it's funny that we're talking so much about technology, but when law firms are genuinely tech first, we won't be talking so much about the technology. We'll just be talking about solving the problem. I think that we're kind of at this point where people have become, we've been using technology for years. You know, Legal IT Insider was founded in 1995. It's not like it's a new thing, but it's just that there's sort of this, you know, people are alive now to the possibilities and talking about technology a lot. I think we're at this kind of bit of a crossroads. So I think we're going to be careful about going too much into the really techie questions, but we can save these questions and come back to you if there's some really techie ones about specific products. I think we'll probably stick out of those weeds, but I'm very happy to have conversations. We're very happy to have conversations afterwards. So there's one about, again, it's just hosts and panelists. So I do litigation that usually involves millions of documents produced in discovery. This is my problem. I used to be a litigator. That was my problem too. The solution would be something that can help review these documents quickly. Where can I find a possible AI solution? Is that to use product specific, or can anybody give a general answer?
I think what's important, and this is the same when we think about some of the generative AI stuff, in terms there's been a lot of talk about the data that goes into it being the World Wide Web and the sort of lack of specialization. I think if you're definitely thinking about sort of whether you're in the litigation space or you're, you know, in your M&A practice or you're in real estate, sort of how specific the data is that's feeding the AI is the thing that you should be focusing on as you scan the market of all of the sort of various AI solutions. So obviously, for litigation purposes, a lot of the discovery tools are very specific. They are very good at reading your sort of emails and your texts. Kira, for example, is focused on reading contracts and finding clauses and concepts. So as we look at all of sort of AI, I know it's been said a million times, but the data that goes into these sort of systems is the most important thing in terms of the output and the reliability. So I just say whatever sort of practice area you're coming from, think about that when you sort of go to speak to people about sort of how the solution's been trained or what data it is using to either generate the content or sort of in Kira with the machine learning system, predict what sort of the clause extraction is.
Yeah. Can we talk about some use cases? Where do you see the potential use cases for Gen AI? This was something that we were planning to talk about anyway, but it came in quite strongly through the questions as well. People really want to talk about the practicalities, not just the sort of high level. So where do you see potential use cases for generative AI, and where are you either already trialing them or seeing them trialed?
So I guess in terms of use cases, some of the obvious ones are things like preparation of summaries. I think the one thing probably to be resolved is the data set point that Josie referred to, because of the hallucination type issue that we have at the moment. So if there's a closed data set, for example, so you know that things are only being based on the data that you're feeding in, that would help. And it'll be interesting to see how clients want to interact with lawyers, you know, how we've previously presented documents, whether it's in tabular format with an overview. If people start working with large language models and using almost chatbot functionality, when does that become the norm?
Yeah, I think that, sorry, Simon.
Just to jump in terms of some additional use cases on that, the low-hanging fruit we've touched on already, the creation of what you might term administrative documentation is an obvious use case for that kind of technology. Equally, low-level creative content, so LinkedIn posts, web content, short punchy articles, starters for 10 effectively that you could then modify is another fairly obvious use case for it. It's a slightly more esoteric way that we've been using it within the context of SIA is one of the challenges we have with the technology is, in order to improve the accuracy and expand what it can actually review, consume and comment upon and mark up, is it needs to be fed a not insubstantial amount of contractual data, contractual information, which pre-Gen AI we were doing by actually physically feeding in the various contracts. But if you need 75 versions of a similar confidentiality provision, that can be challenging if you've actually got to find that out in the wild. Gen AI can actually start to create that kind of content for you if you are sufficiently sophisticated with your prompts, which unfortunately Acoustic Writer X is rapidly becoming.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some really exciting examples in the research space, for example, where they're taking a large language model, but they are using only the data within their platform, so that there's so that you're not going to have the issues around coming up with completely fabricated cases, such as we've seen. I've actually written about the case in the US where ChatGPT came up with 6 entirely fictional cases, but actually if you use the data set, for example, in this case we were talking about Thomson Reuters, they are doing quite a lot of work around Westlaw. They're partnering with Microsoft, other legal research vendors are available, and they are using the data within just that data set, and the large language model is confined to just producing the source from their data and showing you where the data comes from, and if it can't provide an answer, then it won't. And I think that we're seeing more. There's some interesting startups in that region as well. Just had a demo from one from Singapore, which is also searching UK cases, Supreme Court cases, and that's just within research. There's a lot of activity there that I'm seeing, and across the board. I think that you're going to see. It's about partly, isn't it, about enabling people. It's about the way that you communicate and in natural language, but the data point, having spoken to Microsoft, they acknowledge that it is an issue for law firms, because obviously when you've got Copilot going, as one example, going across the whole of your Microsoft 365 suite, the amount of data that you've got in there, you're going to have to be careful that you keep the human in the loop just to accuracy check. And make sure, I think if you've got a specific example, like, oh, I've got this Word document, that everything in there is right, can you please create me a PowerPoint slide, or whatever you want to do that, and that, then I think it's going to be incredible. But obviously there will still be a huge element of checking and verifying, and yeah, the data, I think, is going to be a challenge. So, someone says, is document assembly logically a Gen AI use case? I was going to
touch on that, if I may, because I think we've, maybe as you would expect, really thought quite technically about how sort of LLMs work and sort of the capabilities of the technology in its raw state, and then what does that mean that it is best suited to, from a sort of workflow perspective, as we think about our drafting solutions, as we think about Kira, and as we think about sort of foundation in some of our business of law solutions. And I think the document assembly piece is interesting. I think we've sort of bucketed things that we can see that immediately sort of LLMs provide a really good opportunity. So things that it's great at, things that it's not as good at yet, and then things that we can all see it still really struggles with and would sort of cause problems in terms of the output. I think in terms of sort of document assembly, and we think about sort of the ability of the generative AI to generate content, I think that the less it has to generate, the better at this point. So as soon as you start to get into sort of the idea that it's going to be able to draft something much sort of longer, that's where you start to sort of see that it might not be able to provide as good results as when it's generating something a little bit smaller and more specific. But I think the other thing that we've kind of looked at that sits in the bucket of sort of, this is a really exciting opportunity for what this technology can bring to our existing solutions. And one of those is just sort of that UI aspect that I think we sort of touched on. I think, Dan, you were saying in terms of the usability of technology, that's one of the most exciting areas for us, as we think, you know, what's the difference between a click and a chat? You know, are we really seeing a whole different user interface here that has got people really excited and has got people sort of really able to get time to value in a way that maybe we haven't seen before across sort of technology that's used for transactions? You know, the idea that you can sort of use that chat interface and get much quicker sort of time to seeing value in terms of whether that's search, whether that's, you know, drafting, whatever it might be, I think is one of the pieces that is definitely interesting.
Yeah, and the chat's quite an interesting one, because things like ChatGPT, you see it typing, that's obviously just software coded in that to make it seem more like someone talking to you or replying to you, yeah, exactly, rather than it just popping up. And does that mean that you trust it more because it's like it's thinking rather than it just popping straight out at you at the screen?
I think people do. I think that people are misunderstanding how it works, and that it's a bit like predictive text on steroids, and that they, you know, think there is a slight risk of making it sentient. You know, we talked yesterday about where AI is going and sentience, etc., in a conference I was at, and I do feel like we're starting to get to the stage where people are attaching sort of, I don't know, with ChatGPT, they go, oh, I asked it about this and it said this to me, you know. I think there's a risk. I'm not sure if this next one is a bit too techie to, so if an LLM is trained on a broader data set and then plugged into a client data set using an API, do you still see fewer hallucinations? Does anyone want to take that, or should we take that afterwards? I mean,
it's going to come up with a very loyally answer that depends. So maybe
such a lawyer still. I think yeah, the example that I referred to, where and within research, where it's only able to produce answers from their data set, it will not hallucinate in the way that if I understand that word, which has come up with fabricated cases. A lot of it, in terms of whether it returns what you want it to return, will come down to the right prompt. And I think there's going to be a lot of conversations around how do you get the most out of these solutions, because, you know, you're going to have to ask it questions to come up with the most accurate answer. So it might not be accurate, but it won't come up with something, if it's just confined to the data set, it won't come up with something in the way that we saw with the New York case where it made stuff up. I think we'll stick away from specific vendors' offerings, if that's okay. We'll come back to those afterwards. How much of an issue do you think cost is? I mean, there's been nothing but talk about cost. This is specifically Copilot, but there's obviously, with the big tech solutions, the big tech LLMs, it's, you know, going to be, there's a lot of compute power required. So I've spoken to firms who are now thinking in a bit of a flat spin, to be perfectly honest with you. But how much of an issue do you think cost will or should be in how firms proceed at this point?
Cost, I think, it's a gateway. I think it relates to what we were talking about earlier. So Dan and I would describe usability, reliability, and cost as effectively being the holy trinity of adoption. that something has to be usable, it has to be reliable, but the price point has to be correct. And until all three of those things are right, then it's going to be a challenge to adoption. And with ChatGPT, for instance, being extremely usable and for individual users free, they've got two of those things locked down. But as it's proven to be subject to certain issues around reliability, that's what's stymieing it, and it's actually being fed into law firms locking it down. So there are policies that say that you cannot use it because of those things. So cost will always be a factor, but just as businesses won't use something because it's cool, they also won't use something just because it's cheap. So it's not really about the price point per se, it's about the return on investment. And so there could be a world where $30 per user per month is actually a reasonable fee if there was a suitable business case that said it will more than pay for itself because of XYZ functionality. So cost is always there, it's always going to be a gateway, but it's really about what you get back rather than the literal pounds and pence that you're spending.
Yeah.
We never all pick the cheapest option, do we? We will sometimes buy something that's more expensive because we think it's better. And so, you know, that whole concept of price is, as you said, Simon, just it's linked to the value that people think they're getting out of it, and people are willing to pay more for something that they think is better or more valuable for their business. So, yeah.
Yeah, the interesting consideration with some of the larger tech companies and their offering is we only know the cost now. We don't know what the cost is going to be in the future once it's embedded in our processes, and that's quite an interesting thing to consider going forward.
In terms of it might go up or down.
Well, we don't know, do we? It could go up in the sense that once everyone's linked into it and using it all the time, the demand is there to enable it to go up. Or, you know, there are just so many competitors that the prices go down. We just don't know yet, but it's almost weighing up the risk of either of them, isn't it?
It is. And with this, so this is the risk with the subscription model, isn't it? And but also I think we saw that Meta just released its open source large language model, which is going to be potentially quite transformative in terms of allowing the community to start building their own large language models, and perhaps dilutes, you know, puts a bit of pressure on OpenAI, because it's never good when you've just got one horse, is it? I think that they have been one horse, but it was never going to last very long. I like this question. Oh, actually, there's I'm conscious of time. So everyone's asking their questions all towards the end, but anyway, so what advice, there's one question which is going to be very difficult. So how are legal malpractice insurers viewing use of AI? I think that's a very difficult one for anyone to answer. It's going to be probably with delightedly, I would say, rubbing their hands. Anyone got anything more sensible to add before we talk about the next one?
Well, I know as part of SIA, we've got the human overlay element, and I believe that was communicated to Shoesmiths as part of that process. So we have the overlay piece that sits with it for the quality control side of it, and I wouldn't be surprised if that applies across the board with many AI products.
Sorry.
No, you go, Caroline.
No, it's fine. You.
I was just going to say it definitely comes up from a Kira perspective. Sometimes we're asked, you know, where does the liability sit if I'm using Kira, which I think is always an interesting discussion, but it comes back to our sort of core principle, which is by using Kira, we're not saying you shouldn't read the contract and check and bring that sort of human element to your review. So at the end of the day, you know, the law firm signed the engagement letter, you are using technology to deliver the client deliverable, but it's you who's doing that rather than the technology, and the reliance should always be on you as the law firm rather than on the technology.
On the one hand, that seems like the most obvious assumption in the world, but I'm always surprised how often that is challenged in the market. And I think it's a mindset thing that just because the tech is being used it doesn't mean it should only be used and nothing else. One of the most common issues we have with any technology, not just AI, is this human inclination to want the moon on a stick instantly. So you've learned about something that you didn't know existed 5 minutes ago, but there's something in the human brain that allows you to critique it almost instantly. And that liability piece seems to be a bit of a stumbling block in the market at the moment. It goes back to that comment around DD. It's just the known unknowns of limiting scope. It's the known unknowns of using a piece of technology. The question is it better to produce a piece of work utilizing that technology or not? That's the key question. If it is, it should be used rather than focusing too much on the liability side of things.
I like that answer. I'm going to ask you to be quick. I'm going to rattle through some more questions, but I'm conscious of people's time. This is a funny one. What advice would you give to a lawyer or legal professional asked to lead a firm AI committee? Full disclosure, this is me. Anyone? Just try and keep it quick answers.
Run away, Eric, and hide. No, the serious answer is, and this is what we've found with various pieces of technology, is that the key is to not only engage with your internal IT team, but to have meaningfully engaged stakeholders in different disciplines that can bring different viewpoints to it. So if you are a multi-office firm in different offices, if you're a multidisciplinary firm, get buy-in from different disciplines and get them in on the ground level and take them on that journey with you. The more people you have that have bought into something and have been on that journey and understand the product and that it is better and better is better, the more you mitigate against that moon on a stick factor of then taking it to your colleagues in other areas that haven't been on that journey with you, presenting them a piece of technology, and then them saying, well, can that font be in green, please? Because they will come up with something. So getting that buy-in from the ground up is particularly within Shoesmiths with different pieces of tech. The ones where we've done that are the ones that have disseminated the best and the quickest.
I've also seen, I spoke to a consultant about separating the kind of business as usual from cutting edge. So also separating, in terms of like, so, perhaps the stuff that's the you can achieve tomorrow, and then the stuff that you want to achieve, long way off in the future, and trying to identify from a strategic perspective, how your firm, I think it's partly understanding what your firm does, how it operates, and then working out perhaps, some of the quick wins. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, and there's no easy, leading an AI committee isn't going to be easy, and there needs to be room for making mistakes and just investigating. The ROI isn't going to be there automatically. There needs to be that space to be creative, look at different ways to solve the problems that you've identified, rather than just looking at loads of different types of tech and losing sight of what you're trying to solve.
Yeah, I've seen different approaches. One I wrote actually about Adelsha Goddard, who are just running several Gen AI pilots, and they've sort of at different stages. Some of them are proof of concept, some of them are just pilots, and they just sort of, you guys are familiar with it as well, because obviously we had a dinner together where we talked about this, and I think firms are doing it very much within the culture of their own organization as well. So I think that you have to recognize the culture of your firm, and I think trying to pretend that your firm that you're not is going to make it very difficult to suddenly try and take very radical action. I think it doesn't mean that things don't have to change, though. Having said that, I think we're gonna have to cut out. Is there anything that anyone desperately wanted to say, that because with so much to talk about, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you desperately want to conclude with?
Just one final thought from me, because I think it's relevant to a lot of the issues that we've touched on, is a lot of businesses, a lot of law firms organize themselves on the IT side, the tech side, and then the lawyers and there's a kind of gulf in between. Where we see this stuff work really well is when the lawyers learn to speak tech, and when the tech teams learn to engage with the problems and issues that the lawyers have. That I think also speaks to the advice that I would give to a junior lawyer. Look at the landscape, look at the tools, become conversant with them. You don't need to be a prompt engineer, but you should be conversant with that kind of technology. That's then the catalyst to implementation, adoption, creation, and also being a fantastic lawyer.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to leave it on. And unfortunately, we are at time. I really apologise for not getting around to certain questions, and we certainly haven't got through half the questions that we were going to talk about. I think that's always a good sign. Thank you to people saying have another webinar. That would be good. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's definitely not a topic that's going anywhere. Thank you so much to everyone for listening in. It's really great to have you here. Thank you for your questions and engagement. And Simon, Josie and Dan, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks all.